So welcome. Really excited about today's presentation. And before we get started with that, wanted to again introduce myself. I'm Robin Hassler Thompson with the Survive and Thrive Advocacy Center. We're here in Tallahassee, and a bit more about STAC in a minute. We do this as part of our collaborative work through the Big Bend Coalition Against Human Trafficking, or BBCAT, as we call it here. A little bit of info about us. We meet quarterly. We have networking at our meetings, as well as interesting speakers. Our next meeting is going to be at the U.S. Attorney's Office, heads up, different from the Sheriff's Department, the Sheriff's Association, in September 7. Always would love to have people locally here within this whole North Florida area. If you want to be a part of our work, just contact Kelly. You could always reach out to me as well, so that you can be part of our work here in North Florida. Next slide, please. I should know this by heart, Cassandra. Survive and Thrive Advocacy Center is our local anti-trafficking program here. We work in collaboration with a lot of different agencies, organizations, individuals, faith community, just a whole range of folks. We work to support all people who are trafficked, regardless of age, orientation, immigration status, and any background. We provide case management, and we are especially now trying to do outreach into our rural areas. So anyone who is in this area, in our rural area, is welcome, especially. We work a lot on community education, because I'm kind of joking about this with people now, but it's true. That saying, if you see something, say something, that's something to help someone or to even do whatever. But if you don't know what you're seeing, if you don't know what trafficking looks like, if you don't know, say, that young boys can be sex trafficked as well as young girls, and everyone could be a victim of sex trafficking, or that US citizens are labor trafficked. If you don't know that, when you see it, you may not recognize it. So that's why we do our community education and training. Next slide, please. We have lots of materials for you, and we really encourage you to go on our website. That's it, surviveandthriveadvocacy.org. And I see my colleague Graciela Marquina has joined us. And Graciela is somebody who throughout this does a marvelous job of posting for everybody any of the various things on our website as we start to talk about them today. So that's awesome. Graciela, thank you for being here again today. Graciela does the care management or case management, and has also worked on all these materials. Know that our services and all of our support are free of charge. We also do work to do outreach to those people who are at risk of being trafficked, to work with people who are being groomed, for example, and might not even know they're being trafficked. So we do a lot in the community, not just when we hear about or see about an instance of trafficking, sex or labor trafficking. Next slide, please. One of the newest, best things I think that we've ever done is a podcast, and really encourage you. There's the QR code if you want to subscribe. We have 3 episodes up now, and we say these are enlightening conversations, and they really are, because it's survivors talking about what they have experienced in terms of both today, as they are out of trafficking situations, as they might be advocates, as they might be in the community doing any kind of professional work or whatever. We've got 3 very wonderful podcasts, and we're trying to have one drop every month. So please feel free. They're about 20 minutes long. These are survivors talking about their really recommendations, what they want us to know. And we do a lot to debunk myths. We talk about, as ever, the experts in this are the people who have really been through it. So that's why we are making sure we talk with survivors. Next slide, please. We also have an adjacent website to our work called stacpro.org. And this is a 1-hour online training, free, that you can do. And I will tell you, this is a training that we are working really closely in our community with everyone. We have some interns this summer, for example, and I was able to ask those interns to go ahead and make sure that they take Stack Pro in order to understand the issue of human trafficking. So yes, we have it for our business community, every workplace, nonprofit, for-profit, but we also have it as a good way for you too to use it. Please use it to help ground people, maybe new hires or whatever, on just the dynamics of sex and labor trafficking. And while it's tailored to our community a little bit in terms of the people who are interviewed and some of the demographics, know that what is in here will help you regardless of where you live. Next slide, please. Today we have a wonderful presenter, and Danny Hickey you will meet, and I'm so thrilled to be doing this program with Danny today. I work with Danny on a regular basis. They are the housing specialist, anti-trafficking housing specialist for the International Rescue Committee, or the IRC. I want to give you some bio about Danny, and then we will start our program. So Danny, pronouns they, she, and he, graduated from FSU, Florida State University, in the summer of 2019 with a degree in history and a minor in gender studies. From there, Danny began working in the human services field. Danny began their career running a temporary homeless shelter for the Salvation Army of Tallahassee, and upon successful completion of that grant, moved into the permanent role of case manager. Following a tenure with the Salvation Army, Danny transitioned to Catholic Charities, where they served as a program specialist for the Tallahassee office. At Catholic Charities, Danny executed and oversaw the housing programs offered by the agency in 8 counties. Currently, Danny serves as the housing specialist for survivors of trafficking on behalf of the IRC, or the International Rescue Committee. Through this position, Danny assists survivors with accessing shelter and permanent housing. Along the way, Danny, and I can't believe you do all this and have done all this, Danny has been engaging with a 2-year program to achieve a Master of Social Work and a Master of Public Administration. For the graduation requirement for the MPA, Danny conducted a comparative study on urban and rural emergency shelter programs for LGBTQ plus folks and the effectiveness of addressing housing insecurity. Danny was awarded an exemplary award for this work by the Ruben D. Askew School of Public Administration and Policy. Danny's passions are advocacy and community organizing as it pertains to queer rights and autonomy. Danny believes in using individual voices to lift communities into equality, sustainability, and independence, regardless of age, identity, ability, or background. And Danny, I wanted to do one more thing, which is, as I was thinking about your intro today, I wrote down some words that came to my mind immediately since I've gotten to know you and work with you. And so this is what I want to do on a personal note, to just say, I know Danny to be kind, smart, always prepared, open, dedicated, compassionate, collaborative, giving, a learner and a teacher, a seeker, and a wonderful collaborator. So Danny, thank you for being here with us. It's an honor to work with you always. It's an honor to work with the International Rescue Committee here in our area for all these years. So thank you and welcome. And I will now pull up your slide presentation.
Thank you. Thank you for those kind words, Robin. I appreciate that. Okay. Good afternoon, my friends. I'd like to welcome you all to the training today. From Stonewall to Stonewalled, recognizing and addressing LGBTQ plus barriers in rural and urban human trafficking service models is a project that I've been working on for a long while. I'm really excited to be sharing this with you and engage with you all on this dialogue. I'm hopeful that by the end of today, you'll feel equipped to engage with your communities on LGBTQ issues, housing inequalities, and human trafficking impact, and the intersections that those have through their components. I'd like to think that I'm a very fluid and adaptable presenter, so please, if you have any pressing questions, specifically about something I say, don't hesitate to put it into the Q&A. We'll address it immediately if necessary, or we'll hold it to the end if it's going to be more of a dialogue producing question. But I'm open to both. I'm also still learning and growing in so many different ways. So if I say something that you don't recognize as being correct, or you have a different idea about, I'd love to engage with you in a fruitful, productive dialogue as peers. Next slide, please, Robin. So like Robin was explaining, my name is Danny Hickey and my pronouns are they, she, he, and I identify as someone who is gender fluid, a term that I understand as being part of the non-binary umbrella. The non-binary community is a further sub-community of the transgender community. I have collarbone length or auburn curly hair. I'm wearing a red shirt that ties around my neck, and the background is blurred behind me. I am presently a student pursuing 2 master's degrees in social work and public admin, like Robin was saying, and I am looking to graduate in exactly 2 weeks. Throughout my degrees, I focused on inclusive program design, policy analysis at a legislative and agency level, and inclusionary works with the LGBTQ community. At present, I'm the IRC's anti-trafficking housing specialist, working proudly in Penn counties here in North Florida, serving survivors of trafficking. A lot of what I'm going to be talking about today stems from my MPA thesis, like Robin was saying, Housing the Queer Community. Come on, honey, let's get inclusive, in which I researched and examined the impact of degrees of specialization in rural and urban housing models for queer people, and specifically transgender individuals within emergency shelter. I've adapted this research slightly to include points about trafficking. Next slide, please. Some background information prior to really getting started today. Human trafficking, as we know it, is the means of obtaining an individual through force, fraud, or coercion for the purposes of commercial sex or labor, the exception being minors engaging in commercial sex, as there is an inability to consent to those actions. We refer to this as the AMP model, action, means, and purpose. An additional term I thought important to define would be the Fair Housing Act of 1968, which was signed by President Johnson. This law passed with the civil rights movement to prevent discrimination of the buying and selling of homes based on racial lines. This law has been amended and extrapolated to include communities, including the LGBTQ community, and HUD prioritizes these investigations. There's been the case of Bostick versus Clayton County of 2020, which protects sexuality and gender identity from discrimination. But as I understand it, it has been difficult to implement that specific court ruling and has largely only been applied to employment. Housing as a term is incredibly broad, as it can refer to a ton of different things, from permanent housing, emergency shelter, supportive housing, homeless prevention initiatives, housing vouchers, halfway housing. But for the context of today, I've primarily looked at emergency shelter and its impact on the queer community. And then finally, LGBTQ, as we understand, this is a phenomenon that exists across humanity and deeply into the animal kingdom and can be observed in countless species. I'm not here to debate the existence or morals of my community, and I appreciate that being adhered to. Next slide, please. Some additional vocabulary, just kind of going over some of the things that I'll be talking about. LGBTQ+, there's a lot of different kind of acronyms thrown around: GLBT, LGBT, LGBTQ+, LGBTQIA. So what is this, right? It's a lot, it's intimidating, especially when you don't want to be wrong in addressing a community. I think that there's a lot of positive intent behind it. Many historians link this back to the AIDS epidemic, the origin of this acronym. Prior to the onset of the epidemic, there were gay community centers focused on exclusively gay men and, different kinds of recreational activities. During the 80s, lesbians flocked to the aid of gay men during the AIDS epidemic, donating blood and actively participating in activism efforts. From there, community centers began adapting their names to lesbian and gay community centers. And that's kind of where we see the origins of the LG. Some people have begun switching G and L in the acronym. But many people feel that's putting the work of lesbian activists second, and it's decentering them in a movement that has often been dominated by gay men and silencing to lesbians about activism efforts. So my preference is to maintain the L at the beginning. Beyond that, it becomes regional. A lot of Indigenous communities will include Two-Spirit in the acronym. I personally use LGBTQ+, the most frequently, as I understand it, to be inclusive of everyone, as the community is widely vast and we're constantly adapting it. So I think that plus becomes all inclusive at that point. The A typically stands for asexual, aromantic, and some people tend to put two A's to account for both, but it does not stand for ally, which is something that is often misunderstood about the acronym. Queer is a nuanced term that has its roots as a slur that many people are aware of, that's been thrown against the LGBTQ community. It has been reclaimed in a lot of different spaces, including the academic sphere, but the connotation and atmosphere of it is still important. The terminology like I am queer or they are queer are acceptable if that's someone's identity. The opposite of that would be saying like you are a, and then using the term in that way as derogatory. From there, it becomes a slur, and that's something we should be avoiding. Trans and transgender is an umbrella term that we've already kind of discussed based on my identity as a non-binary individual. It covers people who don't identify with the societal gender that correlates with the sex assigned to someone at birth. So if you're assigned female at birth, but you are a man, that can make you trans. If you're assigned male at birth, but you're non-binary, that can also be understood as trans. Cis and het are abbreviated terms that are often used together, but can also stand alone. So cis is shortened for cisgender, or the idea that your gender identity and sex correlate to one another and correspond with what society understands as your presentation. Het stands for heterosexual. And then finally, a point that I would like to make about NB and the letters NB. NB is an abbreviation in the 4 letters for non-binary. The letters N and B stands for non-Black. People in my community, specifically white non-binary people, often conflate the two and mix this up. But I think it's important that we center those 2 different ideals as being important, but using different verbiage to talk about them, NB versus NB. For the purpose of this, I will always use non-binary because it does get confusing in a vocal presentation, but written, if you're talking about a non-binary person, please use the 4 letters. And then a non-Black person, you may use the 2 letters. Next slide, please. So LGBTQ community and poverty. Queer people experience poverty at vastly higher rates than cisgender and heterosexual people. Contextualizing this a little bit, cis experience poverty rate of 16%, which is a horrible rate. That's far too many people. For my community as a monolith, so the broader LGBTQ community as a whole, it's roughly 22%, which is almost 1 in 4 individuals who are queer are even in poverty. When we look at sub-communities or subpopulations within the LGBTQ community, it becomes more vast. The most prevalent rates of poverty are for transgender people and for bisexual women, who sit at about 30% roughly each. So roughly 1 in 3 individuals in those subgroups. These rates also get more extreme as we account for racial and ethnic backgrounds. A lot of this is because of unequal access to employment. I talked a little bit about Bostic versus Clayton, but like I mentioned, that's been difficult to implement, especially in right-to-work states like Florida. My community is also additionally more likely to be laid off from work, and additionally is more difficult for us to find employment. There was a study that was recently conducted specifically on non-binary people applying for jobs. When they selected they, them pronouns in the application process, their resumes were less likely to result in callbacks and interviews, almost 10% lower than the control groups which use traditional pronouns he or she. The shocking part of that is that 64% of the organizations where this research was done were companies that were equal opportunity employers. So it's not a great kind of place to be starting from if we're existing in places of increased poverty and an inability to find employment. How can we get out of poverty when we can't obtain jobs? Or alternatively, our only option is to sacrifice our identity. Next slide, please. When it comes to homelessness, we're twice as likely to become homeless in the United States compared to cisgender and heterosexual people. Black queer people are higher than white and transgender people are at the highest rate of this, with Black transgender women existing at the highest rate of homelessness. When we look at Black trans women, this metric is the most staggering. We also know that this becomes generational. So queer youth raised in low-income homes are more likely to become low income as adults, and it becomes a cyclical nature of housing instability. From my own personal experience, I have never been unsheltered. I've never been in a situation where I was sleeping outside. However, my family did experience foreclosure when I was younger. And and this would consider my family to be housing unstable. We were never sleeping outside, but during that period, my family was living separately, couch surfing with people in our individual support networks. There's another time when I was financially unable to move between apartments or extend the lease to bridge the gap between those two housing opportunities for myself, during which time I was living from my car and sleeping on the floor of a friend's apartment. So I've never experienced being unsheltered, but I have experienced housing instability directly. And I think it has largely to do with my coming from a lower income home and my identity. That all being said, is one of the largest things that we understand about queer homelessness is oftentimes it's not reported until after the fact. So a lot of queer people don't talk about their homelessness until they've exited that state, which is something important to remember. Next slide, please. Resources. So thankfully, our communities often have resources that can be utilized, but it looks different for LGBTQ community than the traditional broader cishet community. There's not a ton of academic literature on LGBTQ people and their engagement with traditional service providers, especially when it comes to emergency shelter and other community resources for housing. There's very little out there for me to research to base my thesis on. Some of the only academia that I could find was on the foster care system. Queer youth are disproportionately overrepresented in the foster care industry, especially youth of color. This has been linked to intersections with poverty, race, and sexual and gender identity, but also to higher rates of queer youth running away from harmful home environments or being kicked out of their home by family members. In interviews with queer youth who were leaving the foster care kind of system, they reported higher rates compared to cisgender and heterosexual counterparts of feeling underprepared for independent life, higher rates of housing complications following their exit, and a desire for specialized care during their time with the foster care system. More broadly speaking, when it comes to adults navigating needing community assistance, reports show higher level of expressed rates of fear, anxiety, and discomfort reaching out to providers for assistance, largely based on the fear that providers would be discriminating against them. These become more extreme for queer people of color, transgender individuals, and transgender people of color. Next slide, please. So my idea was that there must be a divide in the rural and urban atmospheres. So many of my queer siblings flocked to metropolitan areas for a better life. So this is what I really wanted to examine through the scope of my academic career. Is there more support or better support in urban areas in terms of housing? So what I did was I looked at the Big Bend Continuum of Care and the San Diego Regional Task Force on Homelessness. Both of these are continuums of care, which are HUD-designated entities meant to oversee homeless and homeless prevention initiatives on local, regional levels. I'll oftentimes use COC as an abbreviation to refer to these, and that just stands for Continuum of Care. The Big Bend Continuum of Care serves 8 counties, including Leon County, with the other 7 being highly rural areas. The population served is roughly 500,000 people. The San Diego Regional Task Force serves exclusively the County of San Diego and roughly 3.25 million people in the service arena. I felt that this was a good blend of metropolitan area being San Diego and then the rural community being the Big Bend Continuum of Care. An added point is that HUD mandates that COCs engage in point-in-time counts, which are meant to be a snapshot of homelessness in a given area on a single night. These are conducted yearly. It was not until 2022 that sexuality was added as a demographic feature. However, they do capture gender identities of people. And these point-in-time counts are numbers for people who are unsheltered. They also have reports based on people who got emergency shelter, got other services from agencies under the Continuum of Care, including housing prevention initiatives. These are reported to HUD and they assist with the allocation of funding from a federal level to more local areas, depending on level of need, which is thereby related to the number of people experiencing homelessness in the geographical area. So for my paper, this is where I began. I just pulled these numbers from the COC websites. You can do this through your locality. Every area of the country is covered by a COC, and you can access this data independently. And I just pulled these numbers roughly to get an understanding of what was happening in the 2 areas and began the comparison from there. Next slide, please. So this is the rate in the Big Bend area broken down on the available gender identities and racial backgrounds. This shows that up to 23 individuals in a single year throughout 8 counties in Florida receive services from the continuum. As you know, people can have multiple different racial identities. So we can say up to 23. There's not an ability to remove duplicated identities. So for the sake of conversation, I've just said 23 individuals, but there may be overlap in there, as someone can be Black and Latino, or Latino and white. Racially, in these numbers specifically, we have the most people being white, and gender-wise, transgender. This is a bit inconsistent, as we know that nationally we would expect to see higher rates of Black individuals given the rates of poverty and homelessness being extrapolated for those individuals. However, the rates of transgender does seem to make a little bit more sense given that they do experience poverty at higher rates. At context, 2,384 individuals received services from the continuum care in the same year. Only 23 were gender diverse. That doesn't seem right. So what I did from there was I looked at the San Diego rate to understand it in context with what's happening in an urban area. Next slide, please. In San Diego, it's roughly 486 people of the total 42,537 individuals served by the continuum of care. Again, most of them were white and transgender. When you do the math, though, between the two regions, the rate populace-wise was almost the same. It was sitting roughly just above 1% for San Diego and right under 1% for the Big Bend continuum of care. Where I sought to understand where the people were and why they weren't showing up in these official accounts. If they're experiencing higher rates of poverty, higher rates of inability to achieve financial stability, why are they not obtaining services from these providers? So next slide. This is a comparative chart for the two regions with racial and gender breakdowns. This is the same data from the tables. I just did it for a side-by-side comparison just to kind of get a visual representation of what's happening. It does appear that San Diego is working with the queer homeless much more. And realistically, they're serving more individuals, but rate-wise, it's almost the same, like I said. So I really sought to understand where everyone was going and why they were not obtaining service. So in the traditional Danny initiative, I asked people what was going on. So the first person that I talked to was the Big Bend Continuum of Care. Next slide, please. And I sent her this quote from Eric Layton. He is the data and training director for the Big Bend Continuum of Care. He mentioned that transgender clients still represent a relatively small percentage of our homeless universe, barely over double digits system-wide for last year. And I don't send her this quote to fault him or fault the Big Bend Continuum of Care or any geographical reality. But it contextualizes what I'm looking at and why these people aren't showing up in a way. Our continuums are struggling to find queer people and specifically transgender people. We're barely uncovering them, but we know that they're there from the rates of poverty and homelessness experienced. So I, from there, began questioning who our providers were and what level of specialization they had to meet these complex needs that people had. Next slide, please. Between the two counties, there's a ton of homeless service providers, especially in San Diego County, but I'm primarily looking at emergency shelter. So in Tallahassee, in the Big Bend, we have CESC, which encompasses the Carney Center and the Hope community. Between these two institutions, they provide shelter for individuals and families. There's also Refuge House for domestic violence and survivors of trafficking that happen. They'll serve anyone in the situation that they're in this locality, but it is located in the Big Bend region. In San Diego, we have the LGBTQ Community Center, Interfaith Shelters, San Diego Rescue Mission, and Catholic Charities, all providing emergency shelter in some kind, just some component of the broader community in San Diego. There were a few additional shelters located within San Diego, but I did not feel obligated to put all of them on here as there were too many, and that is not time conducive. So we can expect that because of the larger population, they're going to have more shelters. That's what we expect to see. They have more need there. But I chose then to further stratify my research and look at specifically individuals and not families in emergency shelter, and whether specialization of queer services had any sway on the effectiveness of uncovering these people or serving them. So from there, I chose to look at specifically the Kearney Center and the Big Bend Continuum of Care, and the San Diego LGBTQ Center as my options to compare one another. Next slide, please. The two have very largely similar services. Both provide emergency shelter to individuals. The Kearney Center serves all individuals, which is a component of the fair housing. They have to be open to all individuals at this point. There's equal access in emergency shelter. The LGBTQ Center in San Diego serves all, but with a specialty for LGBTQ people. So you don't have to be queer to go to the LGBT Center in San Diego. They specialize in offering services to them. And in practice, it typically doesn't prevent people from going there. I wouldn't say that, but people kind of self-identify and place themselves into that respective component within the network. And this ensures their compliance with the Fair Housing Act as well, because they're not exclusively serving queer individuals. Kearney Center is the primary shelter here in the Big Bend region, serving most of the individuals. There are a few other kind of smaller opportunities for sheltering, but I felt that Kearney Center was the most largely representative of what I was looking at. And San Diego LGBTQ Center is the only specialized queer homeless provider in San Diego County. They both offer housing assistance to individuals, so folks going in there when they're staying in the emergency shelter have opportunity, have access to funds to rehouse them into permanent options. And I do want to mention that within San Diego, there was a brief stint when there was a temporary LGBTQ homeless shelter opened by Interfaith, a faith-based provider in San Diego. It opened in their neighborhood, which is a geographical region where large numbers of queer people will tend to kind of congregate together in quasi micro communities. But it has since closed. It was open during the COVID pandemic, and they've closed it as they've gotten those rates under control. Next slide, please. So before I really got into what the services and the agencies were doing, I wanted to look at how the agencies could be being held back from serving individuals. Parent, Brewster, Cook, and Harmon studied the impact of stress, the identity as a minority, and satisfaction with services. They understood these as co-influencing factors in the service implementation model, and what they wanted to know was what faith had a component in hand here. So they studied specific faith in clients and the provider, and the satisfaction of service when the provider was of a different religious faith than their own. Kearney's not faith-based, and neither is the San Diego LGBTQ Center, but many agencies within Tallahassee and the rural localities are. So I thought that this may be a kind of component at play with why the numbers were so low, specifically in my rural areas that I was looking at. So what they determined were that folks of a different faith from the agency reported higher rates of dissatisfaction of service. The service provision was more stressful for the client, and that this occurred even when the client's faith may have been more societally prevalent. So if they were a part of a faith that was the more common in the area, and the provider was of a more minority faith, they still felt this perceived power imbalance in their services with the faith provider. Next slide, please. And I did look more into this faith component of services as it is so prevalent here in North Florida and in rural communities. Researcher Fleece looked at this more in depth and looked at the power imbalances between specifically faith providers, the faith community, and the LGBTQ community. Faith has a long history of wrongfully being used to harm the LGBTQ community, and there are plenty of gentle, kind, and accepting people in the faith world. But we also have to understand that for long parts of history, it was used against queer people, and there's still fear based in that harmful usage. It's still being undone, and we as queer people often have long-term kind of systemic fear against those kinds of institutions. Fleece looked at the individual queer person, their identity, and the power dynamic with service providers who were of a faith background. 3 outcomes were observed, and it indicated power imbalances. The first being that showed that the queer person often attempted to reconcile their identity with the faith provider, trying to explain it, providing excuses for their identity, or seeking arbitrary forgiveness from the faith-based provider. The second being queer people being selective on sharing their identity, so not being forthcoming with how they identify and kind of adhering to whatever the faith-based provider expected them to be or put them into categorically based on their own presumptions. And then finally, some queer people did express no change in their identity. They continued to identify how they identify. They were very forthcoming. And there was no change in how they presented to the faith-based provider. So all three of those components are at play. And a lot of that is due to the person on the individual level's understanding of faith, the provider's perception of faith, and the way it influences people differently. Next slide, please. From here, I wanted to get direct input from our service providers, people working directly in the field with these individuals through emergency shelter, as I understand them to be experts. Next slide, please. So the people I interviewed Vicki Butler with the Carney Center. I interviewed Victor Esquivel with the San Diego LGBTQ Center. I interviewed Jonna Coleman with the Big Bend Continuum of Care. And then I interviewed an anonymous transgender individual who has lived unsheltered, and then an anonymous official working in homelessness. Per these interviews, it did come out during the interview process that Vicki Butler identifies as an LGBTQ individual. My anonymous lived experience person as homeless is, of course, an LGBTQ person. But the other three, their identities as queer people did not come up. Those were not things that I was outright asking them. But I do think that that's important to just kind of keep in mind that in those interviews and those conversations, those people did self-identify in those capacities. Next slide, please. Vicki Butler in the Carney Center has served transgender individuals here in the Big Bend area. She reported that when available, trans people are offered private rooms with their own restrooms, shower facilities as they're available. They're typically set aside for people who need different physical accommodations or have different physical abilities than traditionally understood. But when they're not being used for those purposes, they're open to transgender clients as they come in. When they aren't available, or when the individual requests to remain in the general population with the rest of the clients, the care teams discuss with the client which wing, the men's or the women's, would be best for the client. They have an active conversation about that, and she let me know that all staff are trained on how to handle those conversations. She did express anxiety when I discussed the opportunity for specialized care facilities and what that would look like for queer people. And she said that as a component of her own queer identity. Her biggest kind of focus was on the safety component for our queer people in the community, and especially for trans people. Those were her bigger kind of concerns for their safety. And in a effort to support her for that, because I do agree with that, the Human Rights Watch does identify queer people as experiencing higher rates of violence, and especially for transgender people. And the highest vulnerability along those lines are Black transgender women who experience the most prevalent violence in our communities, unfortunately. Butler fears that a single agency servicing these individuals in a rural community would cause strife and saturate areas of marginalized people, exposing them for danger, kind of centering them into a hotspot in a local community where they could end up being targeted and easily accessible by harmful groups. She also noted that keeping the community mixed in terms of the clients, so cisgender heterosexual clients mixed with our transgender clients, mixed with our queer clients, kind of keeps a degree of homogeny from happening. She wants to ensure that those clients continue staying mixed, and have the opportunity to engage in conversations with each other. Something that she mentioned was that for some of her cisgender and heterosexual clients, many of them have never come across a transgender person before in their life, and giving them the opportunity to engage with someone in the shelter where there's kind of a degree of supervision with staff allows for them to facilitate those conversations with the person they may have never come across or felt able to communicate with organically outside of a shelter atmosphere. Butler did explain that all of her staff are trained on the nuances of identity. However, an additional point of research that I came across was that shelter staff are some of the highest proponents of violence against trans and queer individuals. So while Vicki Butler shelter may be running very well and inclusive for queer individuals, we can't say the same for all homeless shelters across the national network. Next slide, please. Victor Esquivel from the LGBT Center in San Diego explains his role as the only queer provider in the county. Queer people can go to any shelter because of the Fair Housing Act, like I said. And in San Diego, he understands that in their other shelters, specifically within the San Diego City shelter, they're served similarly to the way that they are in Butler shelter. The only caveat to that being that there is a separate wing for non-binary people. In Esquivel shelter, they create teams for clients that work on the individual's intersecting identities. And they've also created advisory teams for macro endeavors on the topics of transgender and non-binary issues, Black issues, and Latina issues. And I did put in here Latina, and this is a component of the ever-growing opportunities that I have to learn and grow. I have seen people use Latino, Latine, Latinx. From my understanding, as I have seen it, many people feel that Latinx is a kind of Western thrust upon the Romance languages into a more like Germanic phrasing. The term Latinx wouldn't organically come about in like a Hispanic culture. Alternatively, I have seen that some Hispanic queer individuals find that Latino as an all-encompassing broad term does account for everyone. And then I've also seen alternatively Latine being used the E as more of a kind of gender neutral opportunity to juxtapose the gendering of the Spanish language. I am not Hispanic or Latino, so I am open to being corrected on that input and guidance. That's something I am always striving for. So please feel free to correct me if you feel as though I should not use Latine or I should use something else. These advisory groups that they have created at the San Diego LGBTQ Center, they have several. So they have a transgender and non-binary one. And from there, what they do is they advise the care staff on how to navigate clients who identify in that way and help facilitate their additional needs for like healthcare, for facilities that will provide them with hormone replacement therapy. The Black Advisory Council that they have actually is more on a macro level. So they engage with the higher levels of the board of the entire agency to enact more systemic change for Black communities. And then the Latina kind of advisory council works with the staff to ensure that they have the resources they need for clients who have varying levels of documentation, varying levels of English abilities, and then just the ability to navigate a system that they may not be organically familiar with being from another country. He also expressed nuances of oppression that occur and that giving a rise to the need for specialized services. The San Diego Center has pioneered a few different specialized services. So they were the first organization globally that offers a permanent supportive housing for queer seniors. So they pioneered that. They have several apartments they have set aside for permanent housing that is supportive for elderly queer seniors that need more round-the-clock care that traditional housing can't provide for them. And that's become a model that a lot of other agencies have based it on. And they're hoping to grow some of their other programs in a similar way. And he talked about how those kinds of matrices of oppression manifest in the need for these specialized agencies, and they wouldn't be beginning to crop up if there wasn't. And he talked about how his actual desire would be to not have the San Diego LGBT Center, but that those needs to be able to be incorporated into a traditional model, but they're not. And it just being like a big conversation. He also did express a surge in clients that he has been seeing, and I conducted this interview with him in December. So this is prior to the legislative session in a lot of different states, but he did express that there were a number of clients who were self-identifying as leaving states like Florida and Tennessee due to growing political atmospheres that made them feel threatened for their identities. And he anticipated that given the nature of what the legislative sessions were looking like in their respective states, that those numbers would continue to grow in his agency. He said that many of them cited instabilities and issues in housing as they flock from rural areas, predominantly in the South. Next slide, please. My formerly homeless individual that I interviewed had a lot to say on this. So I was sure to interview this person last so that I had all of these components from what these other individuals were telling me that I could kind of, in a way, get fact checked or litmus test by someone who is, engaged in this process before. So this individual was homeless living in the urban West. Where they were, though, there were no clear specific providers, and because of that, they did not elect to get services. They explained that there was anxiety about not knowing if the broadly servicing agencies would be inclusive or knowledgeable about the transgender issues, and worried about the cost of being quote unquote out, resulting in differential treatment from staff, or worse, being turned down for services. They cited additional components of fear related to access to their hormone replacement therapies, and then gender affirming facilities like restrooms, showers, and also violence from other staff members or clients. They discussed the issue with staff offering choice in which wings in a shelter that they could go in, men's versus women's, and how that's kind of a catch-22 in a lot of different ways. So the opportunity being, do I invalidate my gender and subscribe to the sex assigned to me at birth? Or do I uphold my gender and feel othered by clients? And in either component, I'm risking violence from the other people in that wing. The men in this facility may not think I'm masculine enough, or the women may think I'm too masculine, and vice versa for someone who identifies in the opposite way. So the men may feel I'm too feminine, and then the women may feel I'm too masculine. Based on gender identity and presentation, the risk of violence is present. For specialized agencies, this individual talked about violence that we face in a community without the centers, kind of stemming from what Vicki Butler was talking about. And they were talking about how the violence is going to continue to happen against our community with or without the centers. So with that component in play, we might as well implement some of these specialized service shelters in rural areas to provide for them. Otherwise, they're at the pinnacle of violence with no support apparatus. At least with the support apparatus, they would have opportunity to get some kind of safety net, even if it ended up being somewhere where like targeting could occur, like safety measures could be implemented. And that was a notion that came up with Victor Esquivel and his shelter was, he said that they do face some opportunities for increased violence that other shelters don't necessarily report, but they've been able to accommodate that in increased security measures that they've implemented across the facility that they pay for using their HUD-funded dollars. So the formerly homeless individual talked about putting the specialized service agencies in rural communities, specifically more so than in our urban areas, to try to mitigate some of the systemic issues that happen in those localities. Specifically saying that we're never going to prevent violence at all. We're still going to need services regardless. And also talked about the opportunity for it to be a chance to show the community of the need that community is having, and kind of humanizing them and centering them in a way that Vicki Butler feels as though is being done through the emergency sheltering, keeping the clients together in that capacity. Next slide, please. Jonna Coleman is the executive director for the Big Bend Continuum of Care. She's also been a long professional friend of mine. So I was very eager to get her input on this. I think it's very important. She is a Black woman, so the topic of intersectionality was something she was very eager to talk about. And she talked about the opportunity to allow adjustment periods for our rural areas to kind of try to accommodate some of these specialized programs, specialized agencies, and allowing them to just accommodate and acclimate to the introduction of those services in their area. She did grant that this isn't an excellent solution, that it's not ideal, as you know, it does require a kind of certain amount of time to go about getting those specialized agencies that I think would be better for our localities. So what she offered as a solution to queer poverty and unsheltered rates was working with our existing providers in rural areas to best meet the needs of the community, and facilitating and expanding services in our existing agencies to pave the way for specialized agencies, to begin having those conversations at our existing places before we introduce those places, and branching that out into the broader community. She talked about educating our providers on the nuances of the queer experience and giving them real tools on how to engage with the community, specifically citing things like the opportunity to have more DEI initiatives through our continuum of cares and requiring those trainings for funding. as a potential solution to some of these issues that I've identified. And she's hopeful that this will in turn facilitate queer people to begin slowly coming to providers and providing the staff with the chances to show their growth to the clients and perform the opportunities that they've had to educate themselves. Next slide, please. And I'm going to take a sip of water. Okay. This final individual that I interviewed was an anonymous provider, and they requested to remain anonymous because of the fact that a lot of their conversation and their points they felt were political and would be frowned upon. So please forgive the anonymity. I know that that can kind of seem a little strange, but I still wanted to include this opportunity from this expert in the community. So this individual, he called for activism to ensure government leadership being put into a place to facilitate growth in a way that is inclusive. So we won't be necessarily starting this initiative from the ground up, more so calling for a kind of top-down approach and forcing our leadership to begin having these conversations to pull our providers in that direction. So active work to break out of community biases against queer people in all marginalized communities. They use the term political, but not politicized, in a way that the issue doesn't have to be politicized, but the political aspect is working with elected officials who are going to have these conversations with our communities, that our different levels of need don't need to be politicized, but the need for political weight to have leadership that will steer our communities and engage in how we address inequalities is the foundational component. They talked about gradual change in ways that are active and cited things like rural communities that have a history of being anti-Black and racial inequalities, implementing Black Lives Matter murals. They talked about how typically those murals are put into the Black neighborhoods or near communities that would gravitate most towards that messaging, but within a larger community that isn't necessarily accepting of those kinds of things. I thought about the reality of that existing here, specifically in Tallahassee. We did put up a Black Lives Matter mural, which sits at the edge of Frenchtown, a historically Black neighborhood, and at the edge of College Town, where the population is typically early 20s college students, and that being exactly what this individual is talking about, those being slow initiatives to kind of introduce it to the broader communities. We have to start in the communities where things are going to be productive, and we can kind of talk about those existing inequalities in spaces that may be familiar with it. So we would introduce our conversations about queer needs in poverty through agencies that are already existing in rural communities that specialize in like Black folks, and expanding the conversation in that way. That whole conversation kind of led me to that old metaphor of like, you know, you put the frog in boiling water, it'll jump out. Alternatively, if you put the frog in water and then you slowly heat up the water, the frog does what frogs do in boiling water. That's kind of what it made sense to my head is, you know, following that metric of going through our providers who have already existed in navigating some of these inequalities, and then branching off of the work they're doing and kind of adhering that our partnership in breaking down inequalities is a kind of familial partnership that we have to engage in. Next slide, please. So the environment is something that I did want to touch on, not specifically like the earth in itself, but the conceptual cultural environment that we live in, stepping back from our providers and looking at specifically legislation that's in place in some of our rural areas. Next slide, please. So the laws do have a degree of impact on queer people reaching out for help when we need it. And I do want to explain that and center policy as a point of this. So these are a couple of the laws that are in place. Trans healthcare is a very widely talked about issue. And it became wildly popular after Florida's Agency for Healthcare Administration banned Medicaid from covering hormone replacement therapy costs. So low-income transgender individuals are no longer able to access life-saving affirmative healthcare needs that they have. Alternatively, other states like Oregon and places like Maryland have allowed this expense under their state legislatures, and also allow private insurance companies to cover those costs and additional things like facial surgeries and hair removal in some urban areas. This ends up inherently creating regional divides and pushes people to move or relocate, and kind of pushes those communities out of rural and into urban areas, kind of stratifying and straining the providers that do work with the specialized communities, like the San Diego LGBT Center, has expressed a growing number of clients that is straining their service model because of people relocating that affect their HUD counts, because their HUD count from the point in time count that's done, giving them funding, they're allocated a certain number of dollars to alleviate the issue that's exemplified in their point in time count. So when things like this happen in the middle of those point in time accounts occurring, it stratifies them because they don't have as much money to cover that additional need of people fleeing from other areas. Anti-drag laws have also become popular across the country, and for similar reasons, it causes people to relocate unexpectedly. Many of these bills also have unclear implications for trans individuals and what could be and could not be included in terms of their presentations, and it further risks their legal protections and legal identities. Florida has also recently passed a law that allows for the removal of transgender youth from supportive parents when their parents give the children access to HRT, which further stratifies and strains the foster care industry in Florida and also puts queer youth in an already disproportionate system that exemplifies their needs. Arkansas has virtually made it illegal for transgender people to use public restrooms, a suit that Florida's also filed behind them in. And it's also delineated based on sex at birth. So if you've gone through certain transgender affirming things, you can go about it getting your gender marker changed on things like your driver's license. So you are legally considered the gender that you identify as. However, in Arkansas, you would still have to use a restroom that correlates with the sex that was assigned to you at birth. North Dakota has banned trans people from participating in sports teams that correlate to their gender. Well, this one has less necessarily, like, you may not think people would relocate specifically for that. That seems, I guess a little small. I'm not very big in the sports personally. I think that also feeds into the concept of the environment that's happening. If this is existing in the environment of other laws or other policies or even other conversations that are happening around you, it doesn't bode very well for you feeling safe in your community. Kansas has made it illegal to identify with a gender that does not correlate with the sex that is assigned to you at birth. This one is incredibly interesting to me as it was passed by both houses of their legislature. The governor of Kansas vetoed it, and then the legislature overturned the governor's veto. There's also rampant fear of police. So Polaris Project reports higher rates of fear, discrimination, and violence from police to queer people, with 60% of queer individuals directly expressing that they have had a violent, fearful, or intimidating encounter with police within the last year. These feed into a culture of fear of the outside world, further kind of drawing the queer community into their internal resources and away from kind of traditional means. Additionally, when the law restricts your identity and your community in this way, who do you go to for help? How can you be sure that the law is going to help you when it seems to only want to harm you? This also kind of feeds into the idea of the possible lack in faith for the Fair Housing Act for people that actually know about it. So not a lot of people know about Fair Housing Act. They don't know that they cannot be discriminated against for these certain things, but they lack the ability to know that they can report those things, or they lack faith that those things are going to actually be followed up on. Next slide, please. So this culminates a lot into opportunity for trafficking. So we have codified policies for restricting, othering, and targeting queer people that feed into the notion that the broader community is not here for us. Systemic and rampant poverty coupled with pervasive housing insecurity, the possibility for harmful providers per Human Rights Watch, and a fear for welcoming ones because of past experiences with harmful ones. Then there's a foundational need for support and affirmative needs to so many LGBTQ people who are robbed by the larger community and far too frequently their own families, unfortunately. Many queer people are exploited for trafficking based on this specific need alone, the need for gender affirming care. This can come in the form of medication, so their hormone replacement therapies, or simply vernacular that's being used for them. Imagine if the first person to ever use your pronouns was the person trafficking you. And that's a far too common reality for many queer people who are trafficked. Next slide, please. Queer trafficking is vastly underrepresented, as Polaris unfortunately expects it to be. We would expect it to be a little bit higher. And we think that this feeds back into the research about queer people being fearful to self-identify. We know that roughly 33% of youth that are sex trafficked identify as LGBTQ. I would hesitate personally to guess that that rate is probably higher, and again, stems from a fear of identifying. While being trafficked, they still experience assaults from the community in a physical capacity. And this kind of can facilitate an arena where their trafficker is actually a kind of quasi-protective apparatus for them. So they have a degree of protection from their trafficker, which sounds, really warped, when we think about trafficking, that their trafficker may be a kind of protective place for them, but it can happen where they are being assaulted and the trafficker, is trying to protect this person that they're trafficking. Legislations that are still being passed that harm them, and there's continued employment related issues, sometimes preventing their ability from obtaining income, and it becomes cyclical. So they have to kind of be engaged in trafficking because that's the only way they can go about having their basic needs met, because they're unable to access traditional employment. And then again, the exploitation of them happening to get HRT or affirming words. That's a very common apparatus for queer people to be trafficked through, especially transgender individuals. And there's this additional component of there not being anywhere else to go. So for so many queer people, they've been ostracized from their family. They've tried to relocate to other areas to get a better life for themselves outside of different rural areas and into urban areas, and they have nowhere else to go. They don't know anyone. They have no one who may be looking out for them, and that kind of opens the door for trafficking. And then additionally, if they're being trafficked, if they're across the country from family that do support them or their family doesn't support them, there's oftentimes nowhere for them to go. I was in a webinar recently specifically on LGBTQ people being trafficked and survivors of trafficking who are queer. And something that they said that really stuck out to me is that sometimes trafficking isn't the worst experience someone's had. So they don't think to mention that as a point of reporting, or when they go to get services. For a lot of people, they'll reach the top 10 of the worst experiences that a queer or a trans person has experienced. So they either don't think to report it, or it doesn't come up when they do traditional intakes at an LGBTQ center for housing. So this wouldn't come up because it doesn't seem as though equitably it's as high need compared to some of their other needs for their identity. Next slide, please. So what do we do? I've kind of compiled a few different opportunities for my non-LGBTQ service providers, and I've laid out steps and opportunities. Next slide, please. So for the non-LGBTQ service provider, my survivor providers, I've laid out these kind of steps for us to kind of implement into our agencies, and our intake processes and different things like that. And one of the biggest kind of foundational needs is a revamp of our services. So our products have to be gender affirmative. What does that mean? This means a lot of different things. So this means inclusion of little things like putting tampons in the men's room, the ability to select gender deodorants if we provide those hygiene kits, affirmative undergarments for people, binders for people who may be non-binary or transitioning and they need that. Crucial pieces that many people miss in their services are these little parts where, we kind of instinctually hand someone like a deodorant that we think better correlates with their gender instead of asking them. A simple, would you prefer this shampoo or this one, is a lot better than potentially misgendering someone and then immediately turning them off to getting services from you. And it does go a long way with affirming their gender. Our intakes have to be appropriate. So this is a big one. I know that for a while there was a kind of cultural idea around what are your preferred pronouns? And that is not correct. So we need discussions on what pronouns that we do use, but no one has a preference to be misgendered. People have pronouns, and then you can also use something like, what are your personal pronouns? But removing the preferred component when we ask that, because no one has preferred. And in that same conversation, we need discussions on what pronouns to use with who. So if you're talking with someone in an intake, you know, and they disclose to you that their pronouns are they, them, okay, great. I love that for you. I know that, you know, your mom is a part of your, you know, service here. What pronouns should I be using when we talk about this with her? Little conversation bits like that. And the same can be said about when working with landlords. There can be a lot of fear with that. So what pronouns should I use with working with a landlord? And just those like kind of adaptive questions that we can implement into our intakes. Our facilities have to be more inclusive. Like I said, genderless restroom options, tampons in the men's room, single-use stalls as applicable. You know, I'm not expecting people to go breaking down walls in your facilities or anything like that. But when opportunities arise that you can kind of enact some of these changes, that's what you should be looking for and making proactive attempts to make sure that those opportunities come about for you. If you have a client that identifies as a woman, and you know potentially that they're trans, or you know they identify as a transgender woman, something that can be very affirming is when they come in for their intake, specifically showing them where the women's restroom is. Our staff have to be diverse, and that's a component of inclusion. So clients are going to be more likely to tell their identity to someone who looks, sounds, or acts like them, or who they see as being a part of their community. So when we hire queer staff, we're creating a kind of environmental component for people to feel more comfortable. Our staff members also have the ability to educate us. It should never be the job of our clients to educate us. So if we have queer staff members, we can kind of take some of those questions that we may not understand to a person being paid to, you know, be there and be in that facility and engage in that conversation, as opposed to someone in need. Our community events and outreach to queer spaces, those are incredibly important, and they need to occur outside of the month of June. That's just a kind of bare minimum. They just have to not be just in June. So if you're just showing up to Pride, that's great, welcome. But if that's the only time we're seeing you, don't expect to get, you know, any kind of invitations to, you know, more entrenched events that we have year round. Because queer spaces are very difficult to find, you're not going to find a lot of them from just Googling them. They come from kind of engaging conversations and networks that we build independently through our own networks. And then we also want to make sure that we're offering our identity to the world and not just questioning what other people's identities are. Just because you're cisgender does not necessarily mean you shouldn't be leading with that kind of introduction before you ask someone who you may think is, you know, quote unquote, obviously not, offering that, kind of facilitating the normalness. You know, hi, my name is Danny. I'm comfortable with all pronouns. What's your name? And going from there. Finally, we must be educating ourselves on diversity and seeking to always learn, and that expectation should be on staff as well. So especially client-facing staff. Our first question to a client shouldn't be asking them to explain how a component of their identity works. If that's our first question, we've already failed them in our services. Next slide, please. So for our LGBTQ specialized providers, I think given the rampantness of trafficking, and we also expect that it's underrepresented because of how pervasive it can be, or how it can oftentimes not be necessarily the worst experience someone's had, we have to kind of be a little more proactive in trying to understand if those are existing in our queer clients. So we need to partner with trafficking agencies at the very bare minimum. So we know what questions to ask. We know who to send the people to if we need to kind of facilitate those needs. You know, I would recommend that all queer specific agencies working in housing have a component of their intake process include the AMP model, where you're just kind of trying to test the waters and see if there's that possibility that trafficking has occurred in that person's life. Just because they don't realize it or consider it doesn't mean that they aren't necessarily in need of those services. I also think that there's continued room to be refining our services to best serve the most oppressed communities, including our Black queer people and transgender people. So not just stopping at saying, okay, we serve the LGBTQ community, but taking that a step farther and saying like, okay, we are being proactively pro-Black in our work. We are being proactively pro-trans and standing up for those deeply marginalized communities. Like I said, with the history with the LGBTQ community, a lot of the work for most of history has been centered on gay white men. And we've got to be very proactive in breaking those things down.
Danny, quick
Yes.
question. Would you like to explain for those who don't know what the AMP model is briefly?
Sure. So AMP model is the action, means, and purpose. So that is a component of understanding trafficking. So like a lot of us know, or you may not know, something that we look for in understanding trafficking is force, fraud, or coercion. And that's what we see as the M in the AMP model. So action is the means of like harboring, obtaining a person. The means is that force, fraud, or coercion. And P is the purpose for commercial sex work or exploitative labor services. Beyond that, I think that our queer providers can begin engaging in some certain like subgrantee relationships like IRC and STAC do, and kind of facilitating those conversations and that sharing of information between a specialized agency and a non-specialized agency. Beyond that, I think our LGBT centers across the world can train willing rural providers or non-specialized providers. And I think it's also important that we certify them, giving them something tangible that they can kind of like talk about with the community of saying like, we are here, we're an ally, we want to serve you all. And we've been trained specifically by, the San Diego LGBT Center, the Los Angeles LGBT Center, or, some other queer inclusive group like Equality Florida, things like that. And then we also can't be one-sided. So we have to be willing to open our doors to people that aren't queer service providers. We have to acknowledge that other providers and other systems in history may have caused harm to the queer community, but that if they're willing to engage with us and learn from those mistakes, we have to teach them. They may be able to offer or access resources that we can't. And that's foundational for serving some of our queer clients, especially those that have nuanced oppressions because of intersecting identities. Next slide, please. On an individual level, we have to be committed as applicable. Please, put your own individual needs and safety at forefront. But when able to, financially contributing to agencies that you see doing work that we need to, and in a way that is appropriate. So we also need to be volunteering our time to those agencies. And I think another component of that is volunteering for an agency with a component of identity that you don't necessarily have or that you hold privilege over. Or even additionally, like if you're a queer individual, volunteering with a survivor of trafficking agency or vice versa, survivor of trafficking working with an LGBT center to kind of blend those ideas, those expertises, and the information between those communities. The trafficking knowledge has to be brought to the queer housing arena, and the queer housing services needs to be coming to the trafficking community to talk with them and sharing these ideas between that. And we have to share those individuals on those ideas on an individual level. So that comes from talking with our community, talking to our peers. And I think that this boils down all the way from, being that individual activist who calls your elected officials, all the way down to, calling out Grandma Susie, who uses that inappropriate term at Thanksgiving that no one wants to say anything about. So those are different micro components that kind of boil into our community and boil into our societal ideals and understandings. And just listening to experiences from people in your own individual network. And then next slide, please. And so I'm closing today with this quote from the transgender queer activist, Marsha P. Johnson: "No pride for some of us without liberation for all of us." Activism is at the center, I think, of trafficking work and at the center of housing work. And most importantly for me, the center of LGBTQ+ inclusive work. Activism has to be at the forefront of all of the work we do as providers, as agencies, as, survivors, if there's any survivors on today. These are all components of the work that we all have to be doing for ourselves and for each other and for all of our marginalized communities, no matter where we are, in a rural or urban area. Thank you.
Danny, I just can't thank you so much. There are times when you have a presentation like this, when you know that as you go through the rest of your day or month or years, you're going to say, oh, I remember where I learned that new thing. I learned that today because you had so much good information. One of the things I wanted to also say is that just your point on the slide there that said, you know, we have to do our utmost just to appreciate the diversity of our communities and to learn and to not be shy about asking questions too, right? Because we know we're probably all going to step in it at some point, but how do we approach it with humility and openness, right?
Exactly. That's, I think, the foundation of it too. And I also think that in exactly what you're talking about, recognizing when's the time to ask the question. It is the time that I'm asking this question. Is this going to cause harm to the person that I'm in there interacting with? Or is this more of like a comfortable space where I can have this free dialogue of information? None of us expect anyone to know everything all of the time. But there's a time and a place too. I'm not going to sit down with one of the survivors and ask them to, in the midst of getting services from me, explain trafficking. That's not appropriate. But in opportunities like this, where you're engaging in these conversations, you can ask that question like that you don't really fully understand, but it's like more of a safe atmosphere. That's a wisdom, I think.
And also just to I'm, letting somebody know you're on the learning path, no matter what. I mean, we all
Yeah.
have to learn from each other, and being open. So you're getting a lot of kudos here. Eye-opening, informative, learn more about identification, use of pronouns. Great presentation. So Danny, one of the things that I appreciated too about this is how you gave us kind of a context and then zeroed in on how, the world that we're in creates the vulnerabilities that traffickers can exploit. So one of the things that you mentioned was around HRT, hormone replacement therapy, and how really that vulnerability of needing that, whether it is, okay, I'll do this. I'll, somebody thinks they're either getting a job or engaging in commercial sex with someone who's saying, okay, I'll have money now that I can purchase this myself. Or is that something too that a trafficker will make? I can get this for you if you do this for me. Like the trafficker would actually be the broker. You're right.
I was saying, like, what we have to think about is it in terms of access for insurance purposes. So does someone have the appropriate insurance to be able to get that? Is someone on Medicaid in Florida and they no longer have the ability to get those things? Do they have the money to do their copay? Do they have transportation to get it? I also have heard it being used, not necessarily in the acquisition of it, but then as a force or as a means of coercing them. So withholding the HRT until like certain things are done. So it can kind of become nuanced. It doesn't always have to be like, this is my only way of getting it, but maybe it's like, they have my prescription that I need, and it occurring that way. But I would say, hazarding, I guess, here, it would probably be more of that financial component of like having access to insurance or a copay or something, unfortunately.
Yeah. And then again, what is the larger context of access to healthcare in our world? I mean, so
yeah.
Couple questions here. Someone's wondering if you could explain your pronouns to her or to them. I am still new to this and learning. I don't mean any rudeness with this question. So do you want to explain your pronouns?
Yeah, absolutely. That is no rudeness at all, my friend. That's what we're here for. So I identify as gender fluid. So what that means is I feel as though for my identity, I kind of move around the spectrum of identity. So sometimes I feel as though I present and identify more like masculine, more man presenting, what we would understand as being man. Other times I feel as though I feel more comfortable being more feminine. I have very long nails, I wear jewelry, things like that. So I feel as though I move around that spectrum a lot. And with that being said, I feel as though to most accommodate that, my pronouns should also do the same way. So I use all three pronouns. For me, what works the best, and I think I engage in the most, is like alternating. So a lot of times, like I have many friends who will refer to me in a sentence 3 different times using 3 different pronouns. And that makes sense for me. Other times I've engaged in conversations with people where I don't want to say it's difficult for them to grasp. I don't think that that's appropriate, but like the kind of mental fatigue of making the conscious decision to switch pronouns can be a lot, and I acknowledge that. So for those people, when they, if they're not able to do that as well, I usually encourage them to just pick one pronoun, and kind of stick with it that way. But yeah, gender fluidity is like an entire concept in its own, where it's like some people experience gender fluidity a lot of ways. Sometimes they stick to more one end of the spectrum, and that's typically where I end up being, is a little bit more on the feminine side. But some go the whole spectrum, and then, it can look a lot of different ways. But I hope that answers your question.
Someone else is asking, in the medical field, we are required to utilize legal names, and there are certain labs that are gender specific. What is the best way to address this while being inclusive?
Yeah, absolutely. Great question. So I think that kind of boils down to like an honesty component. For, a lot of people, like I go to the doctor and I get, medication and I have tests run. And my doctors are very good about explaining like, hi, like absolutely love this, they, she, he, like most of my doctors are very acceptable for those kinds of things, but they also are like, this is what you're going to see on this paperwork. And they explain to me why. And it's just like, this is the conversation of like, this component is like for an understanding, like chemically at a level, what's happening potentially in your body. And this helps us kind of understand it in that capacity moving forward. And just going about it, explaining to me, like, we know that this is your name. We know that this is the way you identify, and these are your pronouns. We support that. And then from there, but going through a conversation of saying, like, if you look at your lab slip, it's going to say this. And just preemptively explaining that situation and why it is that way. I think, we run into this a lot too. Robin and I do with our direct client work. We're asked for the sex of the individual that we're working with as a part of our intake. And so I go about that conversation with my clients. I'm like, how do you identify? Like, are you, what are your pronouns? And then from there, I'm like, okay, I'm going to ask you a question about your sex. I apologize. This is why I have to do this. And it makes it a little bit more of an engaging conversation. So it's like, I don't care at an individual level. There's just this kind of arbitrary environment that I have to submit this information for this purpose. And I think that that's the main reason in the medical community.
And it really sounds like, again, it's another opportunity to have that conversation, right? And just don't make assumptions, being, inclusive with the individual, and just kind of be real, just be informative, provide options. I also wanted to share briefly, Graciela's on the webinar, but she told me that the other day when she was every week she's at the Kearney Center, as talking to the residents there, and she had a rainbow flag just stuck in her bag, like, so people could see that she had a rainbow flag, a small rainbow flag, like the little ones we wave. And someone stopped her and just pulled her aside and said, "Thank you, just thank you. I really appreciate you having that." And they opened up a conversation. But it was just that small act, you know what I mean? It was just like that one little thing when you had that slide about what we can do as anti-trafficking providers, that made the world of difference to somebody.
Showing up and visibility, it's important.
Exactly. All right. Any other questions? Let's see. I'm looking. Thank you so much. Perfect sense. Yes, the pronouns explanation was great, and you're getting lots of thanks. So I would like to add my voice of thanks to you for having this program today. Anything you want to do to wrap us up, Danny? Anything else you want to share?
I think I don't know that I necessarily have anything to wrap up. I did see Brenda put a question, and I think it may have gotten buried. Williams. Brenda said, considering the recent climate in Florida, how do we encourage trafficking victims to reach out for assistance? So, I mean, I think what you're asking possibly is like specifically like queer survivors of trafficking. How do we encourage them to reach out for assistance? So I think that something I encourage people all the time to do, we have to put our safety at the paramount of things. So, this kind of feeds into that point of the research where I was talking about, where sometimes queer individuals don't feel comfortable self-identifying, and reminding people that they have that ability. So just because someone asks you, like, what is your sexuality or what is your gender identity? If you are in fear of your safety, I always will advocate for, making yourself safe in a way of, what information you offer. So if you think, someone is a survivor and they're, LGBTQ and they could risk harm for that, you know, if there's opportunity for them to be withholding of that part of their identity in order to get what they need, I support that. And alternatively, I know a lot of our service provision models, there are components that assist with relocation. And if that is a needed thing, there are dialogues that can happen about that. There's a lot of other, specifically queer-centered resources that are a bit under the normal radar that connect with relocating people who are in unsafe areas. And just facilitating that conversation of like, what's going to make you most comfortable? What's going to make you the most safe? And how do we engage in that dialogue? And how can I support you in that?
Yeah, and I'd also mention too, you cited to the Polaris Project quite a bit, and they've got a lot of great information about human trafficking and the queer community. I think that they can be a good resource. I wanted to offer too that if anybody is having issues or questions, to reach out to us at STAC, to you, Danny, and we can connect us. That's what we do. We're a hub agency to work together. So if you have any specific questions or this is coming up, please let us be a safe space for you to do that. And we also have on the STAC website, surviveandthriveadvocacy.org, we have a get help button there. We do have some resources nationally. The Trevor Project does a really good so there might be other places too that you want to explore, and knowing that there are safe places here in Florida, even though there is such, the political climate is what it is. So thank you for that. Did I miss anything else, Danny?
I didn't see anything.
I went through, people like the Latine. Did you say Latine or Latine?
Latine with like an
I
E.
like it. Somebody's saying that sounds so pretty and that it sounds like a good option. Like I had not heard that. That is excellent. So you got a lot of good stuff at the beginning around that.
Perfect. I'm glad.
Danny, I can't thank you enough. This has been great. I think you've helped us ease into a happy and more, and I feel smarter. I just really feel more grounded. So, thank you for your excellent research. Congratulations on graduation. I think we need to kind of, raise a glass to you somewhere sometime soon. Thank you, Danny. Thank you, everybody. Have a great weekend.
Thanks, friends.